My Ending to the Marriage Stone by Crookshanks 87. Chapter 3, or 79. His whole body ached. It felt as though every muscle in his body had been pushed beyond the limits of endurance. Even his eyelids, Harry noted as he opened them. His surroundings quickly came into focus. Unsurprisingly, he was in a hospital bed surrounded by a curtain. Ever so slowly, he turned his head to the side, searching for somebody sitting by his bed. Normally, people started talking at him the second his eyes were open. Harry's gaze finally reached Severus. He had fallen asleep, sitting by Harry's bed. Severus couldn't be comfortable, Harry realized. The chair holding Severus was made from stiff wood, and Severus had slouched down in the chair with his neck arching off to the side, head lolling, unsupported. Harry stared at him, taking in the details of his face. He knew he should wake Severus. The crick in his neck would be horrible. Severus would want to talk to him, and Harry had plenty of questions himself, but Harry couldn't find the words or strength to wake him. Instead, he just stared. Black hair fell across half of his face, contrasting with the white of his skin. His lips were gently parted, and Harry could see them move slightly each time Severus exhaled. It was very peaceful watching him. Peaceful. Harry's stomach churned violently as the events of the past days resurfaced in his mind. He had failed. He didn't want to think about that, about the dying muggles, about Voldemort's victory, Voldemort's failure. How many had died? How many had survived? Why hadn't he seen Ron or Hermione? He needed to know. Harry tried to lift his arm to reach out to Severus and failed. He couldn't remember feeling so weak, not even when he had stolen the Eye of Odin. It was like every last drop of magic had bled from his body. Severus, Harry whispered gently. Only after repeating himself several times did Severus respond. Severus's head whipped up with eyes wide, immediately seeking out Harry. Just as quickly he reached up and touched his neck, wincing. A look of relief crossed his face as he met Harry's gaze. "How are you feeling?" Severus asked in a voice rough with sleep. "I'm fine. Just exhausted," Harry said simply. "You have magical exhaustion. Pomfrey's ordered at least a couple weeks of bed rest and absolutely no magic," Severus explained. Harry nodded, then winced as his muscles revolted against the movement. Harry was slightly startled as Severus reached up and placed his hand on Harry's forehead, checking his temperature. He pondered the implications of bed rest and no magic. It meant he wouldn't be able to help with any rescue efforts that were ongoing. He wouldn't be able to help fight if Voldemort attacked. He would be relatively useless for the next couple of weeks. Pushing thoughts of the future and what-ifs out of his mind, he focused on the present. He had woken Severus up for a reason, after all. "Are Ron and Hermione—" Harry trailed off, biting his lip nervously. "They're fine. They weren't hurt," Severus answered curtly. Harry sighed as relief coursed through his body. "Where are they?" he wondered. They normally tried to sit with him as much as possible when he was injured. "Probably eating dinner," Severus answered just as he finished checking Harry's pulse. "Would you like anything to drink or eat?" Harry didn't feel particularly hungry, but supposed he should eat to help keep his strength up. "Sure." Harry was unsurprised when Dobby answered Snape's summons. Dobby was almost crying in relief to see that Harry was alive and awake, yet at the same time he was jumping in an exuberant dance of joy. Snape asked for food and sent Dobby off before he could bombard Harry with his sentiments. Harry wasn't quite sure what to say. As he looked up at Snape, he saw on Severus's face that he didn't know what to say either. Harry desperately wanted to know what had happened, who had survived, who hadn't. But at the same time, he wasn't sure if he was ready to face the world. He didn't want to know how badly he had failed everyone. He moved his arm upwards a centimeter and let it fall back down. It was agony. He could barely move. He was more helpless than a first year. Snape continued to stare at him in silence with a thoughtful, almost anxious expression on his face. Not caring if it was cowardice, Harry decided he didn't want to know. Not now. He couldn't help anybody in this state. It wouldn't matter if he didn't find out the events of the past couple days for a little while. He could take a single night off and rest in his hospital bed without worrying about the rest of the world. Maybe it was selfish. He didn't care. He would face the rest of the world tomorrow. This made him wonder, when was it? "What day is it?" Harry asked. "Friday," Snape answered. Oh. Harry looked down. Date night. As silly as it felt, Harry couldn't bring himself to care that he'd been unconscious for over 3 days. He knew he should care, but the only thing he could think about was Severus and him were supposed to go on a date tonight. Feeling ashamed, and again somewhat selfish, Harry admitted to himself, despite the fact that the world was in upheaval, he still wanted his date. Couldn't he have one thing in his life that was normal? He sighed in disappointment, realizing their date would have to be delayed. He couldn't even get out of bed. Flushing slightly, he realized some people might enjoy spending entire dates in bed. Dobby returned with their food.
Dobby is bringing Master Harry and Master Snape their food,
Dobby said proudly. Harry was surprised to see the food for Severus. Nobody ever ate with him in the hospital wing. Thank you, that will be all, Snape said, dismissing Dobby. With a pop, Dobby left the two men alone. Snape sat down on Harry's bed beside him. Harry's heart pounded. He was intensely aware of Severus's proximity in bed next to him. Harry wasn't sure why he was reacting so strongly. They slept in bed together every night. Perhaps it was his previous thoughts about bedridden date activities. And then Severus leaned forward, so the two of them were chest to chest. Harry froze, uncomprehending. Severus gently slid his arms behind Harry's back and lifted him up into a sitting position. Severus was helping him sit up so he could eat. Harry exhaled. Whether it was in relief or disappointment, he wasn't sure. Perhaps it was a bit of both. Whatever Severus's intentions, Harry had to admit it felt nice to be held like this. Almost a hug, with strong arms around him and the heat of another body soaking into his chest. And then Severus moved several pillows behind Harry's back, gently rested Harry back into them, and let him go. Harry wasn't entirely happy Severus had let him go. It had felt nice. Comforting. As Severus set their food up to eat, Harry wondered how it was possible this man was the same man that had reduced dozens of students to tears in front of Harry. It seemed impossible to Harry that the Severus that treated him so carefully could be the same Professor Snape that cruelly ridiculed students. But he was. And Harry couldn't help but wonder why a man who had no patience for children, who was talented enough to get a dozen other jobs, who was rich enough not to need a job, worked as a teacher. It was probably for Dumbledore and the Order anyway. Harry decided not to ask. There was so much he didn't know about the man. Severus sat down in the chair next to Harry's bed and began eating his food. Looking down, Harry saw his plate was filled with soup and bread. Sick people food. Even if he was hungry, he doubted he'd find this appetizing. Then again, he felt lucky to have the food. It wasn't so long ago that he was locked up and left unfed when he was ill. Slowly, Harry began to eat. And it was slowly. His sore muscles ensured that. But as he ate and moved his arms from his plate to his mouth, his muscles began to loosen up and relax. He was embarrassed to note that his hands were shaking slightly from the effort. Finally, Severus broke the silence. My apologies. I believe I'll have to break plans. I won't be able to take you out on a date tonight. Harry wasn't entirely sure, but Severus almost seemed nervous as he spoke. Oddly formal. How strange. Perhaps we can have our date here, Severus suggested with a raised eyebrow. Harry's heart leapt in excitement. Maybe he could have one normal night after all. Well, going on a date wasn't normal for him, but it was something normal people did, and it seemed Severus wanted the same thing he did. I think that'll work, Harry said with a smile. Severus felt himself relax. Harry hadn't rejected him outright. Snape wasn't ashamed to admit he'd been worried Harry would object to the timing. He'd spent the afternoon sitting by Harry's bed trying to figure out something they could do that would be date-like with Harry in a hospital bed. Snape wasn't impressed with any of his ideas and doubted Harry would be either. Chess, exploding snaps, checkers, they were hardly brilliant. Being limited to the hospital wing certainly restricted the date potential. But honestly, Snape couldn't kid himself. It didn't matter where they could go. He simply wasn't a romantic person. The idea of Severus Snape planning a romantic date was about as good of an idea as Lucius Malfoy planning a Muggle-born pride parade. Utterly ludicrous. Eventually, Snape settled on the idea that he would eat dinner with Harry, if Harry didn't sleep through the night, and just tried to talk to him. Couples did that for dates. Sure, they normally went to fancy restaurants, but that wasn't exactly an option. Now that both he and Harry were awake, he wasn't quite sure what to say. He didn't want to bring up the disasters of the past couple days. He wanted to see Harry enjoy himself. Harry deserved a night just for himself. He gave so much to the world and got so little back in return. Severus just wanted to give him one night where he didn't have to worry about the world collapsing around him. A night that Harry could relax. Rest and relaxation would do wonders for Harry's mental state. Severus had worried Harry would want to hear the story of the past days right away, and he would spend the night brooding over the past. But after discovering Ron and Hermione were well, Harry didn't seem interested in learning the rest of the horror story. Severus watched carefully for any signs of mental distress on Harry's part, but he was very composed, if not a little quiet. And so Severus had brought up their date. It seemed Harry wanted a night for the two of them as well. Maybe Harry realized he needed to rest. For once things were working out for Severus. He was getting his date with Harry. Now he just had to make some kind of conversation with Harry that a couple would have while out on a date. Maybe he should have brought a chessboard. "How's your dinner?" Snape asked. Making small talk was not his specialty. Harry gave him a strange look before answering. Apparently, Harry thought he was acting out of character. "It's good. And yours?" Harry said in a voice as normally as possible. The look of confusion on Harry's face read loud and clear to Snape that this approach wasn't working. It was making Harry uncomfortable. "Good," Snape replied stiffly. He sighed and decided on another tactic. "You don't want to talk about the war, do you?" he asked Harry for confirmation. Harry nodded with a dark look in his eyes. "I'm rather new at this whole romancing business, but couples do normally try to get to know each other better. Is there anything you wanted to know about me? I know there's plenty I could ask you," Snape suggested. This was strange for him. He used to be confident, in control, in the know, not awkward and lost, struggling for words. But it seemed his plan had worked. Harry smiled, and Snape could see the curious gleam in Harry's eyes. At least Harry was inexperienced in this dating business as well. "Why do you teach here at Hogwarts?" Harry asked quickly, but quietly. Snape was surprised by the question, but was pleased Harry thought about him enough to be curious. At least it wasn't too intrusive a question, but then again, that was the point, to get to know each other intimately. "After the first war with Voldemort ended, I was branded as a Death Eater, not officially, but it's what the general public widely believed. Dumbledore was the only one that would hire me," Snape answered smoothly. Harry bit his lip, mulling Snape's answer over, and Snape couldn't help but admire Harry. He was utterly handsome. How someone like him had managed to marry such a man was beyond him. Just as Harry stopped biting his lips, he licked them before taking another bite of his dinner. He couldn't help but notice the soft pink texture of Harry's tongue. He wanted to kiss Harry, soothe those lips with his own tongue. "But why work? You have plenty of money." Harry startled Snape out of his lusting. "I'm not the kind of person that likes being idle. I enjoy being productive, having a career, a purpose, and while teaching would not be my first choice, up until recently it's been my only choice," Snape explained calmly. He did still feel bitter about the situation, but given the current state of the world, he simply felt grateful to have Harry alive and with him. He only felt a mere twinge of the anger towards the situation he once did. Snape watched as Harry slowly lifted food up to his mouth. It was almost painful to watch. Harry must be so tired. Momentarily, he pondered hand-feeding Harry. If only he'd asked Dobby to bring fruits and chocolate instead of soup and bread. Snape mentally chastised himself. Romancing Harry was not about getting Harry into bed with him. It was about forming an emotional connection between the two of them. Besides which, Harry was in no condition for physical activity of any kind. He shouldn't even kiss the boy. They could get carried away. When Pomfrey specified bed rest, she certainly didn't mean Harry could be active in the bed. It didn't matter how much he wanted the boy. He couldn't touch him. At least not until he recovered a bit more. Tonight was about a romantic relationship, not satisfying his baser needs. Not to mention, he still didn't know what effect his dark mark could potentially have on Harry. How infuriating. Snape returned his attention to Harry. It didn't matter, he wanted to kiss him. It didn't even matter that the boy would probably let him. Welcome it even. Harry was sick. He focused on their conversation. The two continued asking and answering questions as they both ate. It was amazing how much a person could not know about another person they had been living with for over 6 months. They continued in that manner until Harry informed Snape he was done eating. Harry had enjoyed learning more about Severus, asking questions he had always wondered about, but felt were off limits. And at first he had felt self-conscious as Severus asked about him. There were very few people he knew that took such a personal interest in him, not counting reporters. But Severus had seemed interested, as though everything he said was of vital importance. He even acted interested when Harry talked about why he liked playing Seeker more than any other Quidditch position. The attention was almost unnerving as Severus stared into Harry's eyes. Several times he felt himself blushing under Severus's intense looks. He actually managed to keep his mind off Voldemort the majority of the time, although occasionally his thoughts would stray away from the conversation and go back to that searing kiss Severus had given him right before he had asked him out on this date. It had started out so intense, overwhelming, as Severus was out of control. But once he slowed down, it was incredible. Better than he could possibly explain. He wanted to feel that way again. And Harry realized, for once, he was thinking like a normal 16-year-old. He couldn't stop thinking about sex. He wasn't ready to do the deed yet, but he was ready for another kiss, like the last one he and Snape had. Harry didn't care if there were more important things to be doing, if there were more important things to be thinking. He wanted to kiss Severus again. He wanted to forget the rest of the world existed, get lost in sensation, feel that tingle going up and down his spine. While he could now move his arms without pain shooting through his body, he certainly couldn't reach Severus sitting in a chair beside his bed and kiss him. He was too far away! Besides which, despite his Gryffindor status, initiating a kiss with Severus certainly seemed intimidating to him. He suddenly understood why so many boys in Gryffindor Tower had strategy discussions on how to move in for a kiss. It was much harder and awkward in practice than in theory. At least he knew Severus was attracted to him. It wasn't likely he'd be rejected. But why wasn't Severus initiating a kiss of his own? That's what dating is about. Harry felt a wave of admiration for Severus. Thus far, Severus had initiated all of their kisses. While Severus hadn't seemed nervous, it certainly must have taken some courage on his part. Severus hadn't even known if Harry wanted to kiss him back. Maybe he was just overthinking this, Harry reasoned. Severus acted fast. He couldn't have planned and thought out those kisses, but Slytherin sure did like to think. Perhaps Severus wasn't kissing him now because he thought Harry was too sick. But if that was the case, Harry would just have to initiate it. His stomach clenched into fear. But he wanted a kiss! Harry would just have to do it. But how? His muscles were too sore for him to lean over the edge of the bed and reach Severus. Maybe he could ask? Harry flushed. Maybe he could succeed in topping the "Are you having sex?" comment. He couldn't even picture himself saying the words, and just imagining Severus's response made him feel embarrassed and uncomfortable. Severus spoke, jolting Harry out of his thoughts. "Are you sure you're done eating?" Snape said, eyeing Harry's half-eaten bowl of soup and untouched bread. Harry looked at his plate and nodded. The soup had been better than it looked. He just wasn't very hungry. "Definitely." Snape summoned Dobby to take their plates away. Dobby popped in, took their plates, and disappeared with a snap. Well, it was now or never, Harry reasoned. He wanted his date tonight, and he wanted his kiss. If he couldn't move in himself, he would just have to let Severus know what he wanted. Harry decided he would try a more subtle approach at getting his message across than flat out asking. Snape was intelligent. He would figure it out, and if he didn't, Harry would ask. Ignoring the fluttering feeling in his stomach, he concentrated on what he wanted. Another searing kiss. Harry lifted his hand up, it was less and less tiresome every time, and moved it over towards Severus's thigh. Exhaling, he rested his hand on Severus's knee. He looked up. Severus met his eyes staring at him in surprise, lips parted and shock eyes widened. Immediately, Harry blushed and looked down. By Merlin, what was he doing? He opened his mouth to say something. He wasn't sure what, anything to explain his actions, but before he could say anything, he could feel Severus stand up from his chair and sit down beside him on his bed. Harry's heart was pounding wildly with excitement, anticipation, and a small amount of nervousness. Raising his gaze, he found Severus staring at him with an indiscernible yet intense look on his face. Severus maintained eye contact with Harry as he slowly lowered his face to Harry's, watching his response. Harry spared a thought to wonder if the human heart could actually explode from pumping too fast. And then Severus's lips were on his. Severus's lips moved gently but firmly against his. It felt even better than he remembered. Almost desperately, Harry moved his lips back against Severus's. He wanted more, and he got it. It felt like a jolt of electricity through his body as he felt Snape's tongue flick against his lips. Harry gasped in response, and Snape used the opportunity to deepen the kiss, plunging his tongue in Harry's mouth. Severus ran his hand through Harry's hair and down his neck, letting them settle on Harry's shoulders. Still, Harry wanted more. Harry reached out, ignoring the ache in his arms, and placed his hands on Severus's hips, trying to pull him forward. Severus responded more swiftly and completely than Harry possibly could have imagined. Without breaking the kiss, Severus swung his legs over the bed and straddled Harry. He couldn't help but moan in surprised pleasure. Harry could feel the heat and weight of Severus's chest against his. Severus's thighs positioned around him, his arms pinning down Harry's arms, his tongue moving frantically in Harry's mouth. It felt like his whole body had been set on fire. It was perfect. It was bliss. He couldn't get enough of it. He couldn't even think. It was incredible, sensational, and suddenly overwhelming. Severus was frantic, out of control. He needed to slow down. He wasn't ready to go all the way. He wanted Severus to kiss him slowly, sensually, not desperately. He certainly didn't want to stop. Harry would just ask Severus to slow down, but he didn't have a chance. Harry and Severus were so distracted with each other that neither noticed as Sirius and Remus pulled the curtain open around Harry's bed. Neither of them noticed as Sirius stared in shock, barely able to restrain himself from bodily throwing Snape off Harry. Nobody noticed as Remus frantically shut the curtain and strengthened the silencing charm around Harry's bed. No, Harry did not have a chance to ask Severus anything. Sirius Black, on the other hand, demanded quite forcefully, "Get off my godson!" Sirius bit out each word loudly, voice colored with rage. Harry froze in complete panic. He was embarrassed, mortified, humiliated. Sirius, of all people, got him sucking Snape! Severus had the opposite reaction. Instead of freezing, he flew! He flung himself off Harry, sprang to his feet, facing Sirius, quite prepared to be hexed and hex in return! And then time seemed to still, with Harry lying in bed, closing his eyes, trying to pretend this wasn't happening. Severus stood prepared to defend himself. Sirius was staring in rage. Remus was ready to prevent a fight. Sirius surprised them all again. He didn't even mention Snape snogging his 16-year-old innocent godson. He had come to deliver a message. "Dumbledore needs to see you in his office. Right now." Sirius ground out between his teeth. Harry opened his eyes in surprise and nearly shut them again to black out Sirius's expression of fury. He wasn't mentioning their kissing, but he was mad. "Why?" Severus replied as levelly as he could. "Dunno. Said it was an emergency. I'll stay with Harry. Remus can go with you." Severus opened his mouth to protest, but Remus spoke up, cutting him off. "No, I'll stay with Harry. You and Severus go see Dumbledore together," Remus said firmly, giving Sirius a stern stare. It looked as though Sirius was about to protest as well, but stopped himself. "Fine." Severus sat and looked between the two men and Harry. He clearly did not want to live with Black. "Sirius," Harry began, "please behave yourself." Harry looked into Sirius's eyes and mentally pleaded with him not to start a fight with Severus. "Dumbledore needs you both." Sirius's face softened as he looked into Harry's eyes, seeming to understand. Sirius nodded silently. "Let's go," he said in exasperation to Snape. Sirius turned to go, but Snape turned to Remus. "Harry needs to rest. Make sure he gets some sleep," Snape ordered to Remus. Remus nodded patiently. "Of course." Sirius looked as though he was about to explode at Snape's comment, but managed to restrain himself. "After you," Snape said with mocking courtesy to Sirius. Sirius glared back angrily. They both slipped through the curtain stiffly and disappeared from Harry's sight. Why in the world Remus wanted Snape to go with Sirius must be out, Harry. "Why'd you send Sirius with Severus? They'll kill each other," Harry asked Remus tensely. "What's going on?" "I'm not sure. Dumbledore just said that he needed to speak with Snape immediately," Remus began in a calm tone. "And Sirius and Severus won't kill each other." Harry snorted in disbelief. "They had a kind of reconciliation while you were unconscious," Remus said in a soothing tone. "Sirius was furious," Harry stated, "and you know him and Severus. Sirius can control himself. You'll see. Besides, if Sirius hadn't gone with Severus, he'd be here with you, asking you what the two of you were doing." Harry blushed furiously, remembering exactly the position they had been cut in. His pajama bottoms did very little to hide how excited he had been. More than that, Remus continued, Severus would be worrying about what Sirius was saying to you. Dumbledore needs Severus's full attention. Severus will be able to handle Sirius, he finished firmly. Harry sighed, knowing it was true, and hoping that they wouldn't fight too much. At the very least, there wouldn't be any permanent damage. Now that they had that sorted out, he began to feel the full weight of the situation. He glanced up at Remus and blushed furiously. Remus gave him an understanding look and smiled. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, Remus assured Harry. Thanks, Harry replied quickly. But if you do, or if you just have any questions, I'm here, Remus added. Harry looked down, nodding, but remained silent. Harry remembered the question he had wanted to ask Remus after him and Sirius finally got together. He had wanted to know how it had been. The idea of asking a father figure was way too embarrassing to even think about. He'd find some other way, and he'd certainly had enough embarrassment for one night. Harry frowned in disappointment as he realized his date had been cut short, probably due to some Dark Lord emergency. He sighed. How utterly typical of his life. He should just accept it. He wasn't going to get to take a night off for Voldemort and just forget about it for one night. He might as well face the music now. He'd find out sooner or later anyways. Harry turned to Remus, pushing aside thoughts of Severus, and asked what he had missed in the past days.